Today on Sugar Spun Run, we're going to be making a cheesecake stuffed chocolate cake. Hey Sugar Spun Bakers, Sam here, and today I am so excited to be sharing another carefully tested, well-researched, and perfected recipe. We are making one of the most decadent cakes in existence. This is a dark chocolate cake stuffed with a full cheesecake and iced with a marbled cream cheese frosting. Now, when I make this recipe, I usually like to start a day in advance because we are going to be beginning with our cheesecake layer, and that takes about 4 to 6 hours to chill. So I just like to make it the day before. That way, once I make the cakes, everything is good and ready to go. Let's go ahead and get started by making our cheesecake. So you're going to want to preheat your oven to 325 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, to make our cheesecake, we're going to start by combining 24 ounces of softened brick-style cream cheese in a large bowl and adding 3/4 cup of granulated sugar. Now, today's recipe could be made in a stand mixer using the paddle attachment, but today I'm just going to be using an electric hand mixer. And we'll cream together the cream cheese and the sugar until everything is smooth and creamy and there are no lumps remaining. Now, you do want to take care that you don't overbeat the cream cheese at this stage because you can incorporate too much air into it. You just want to make sure it's smooth, but you don't want to overdo it. Next, we're going to add 1/2 cup of sour cream and just a teaspoon of vanilla extract, and we'll stir those in as well. Now, the next thing that you need for today's recipe is 3 large eggs, and preferably these should be at room temperature. Now, anytime you are making a cheesecake, you want to take care that you do not overdo it when you're mixing in the eggs. For one thing, over mixing the eggs or over beating the eggs with an electric mixer can cause cracks in your cheesecake. We're really not worried about that today because our cheesecake's going to be hidden inside the cake, but over beating the eggs can also cause your cheesecake to have a sort of mealy, almost curdled appearance and texture, which is just not nice. We want a nice smooth cheesecake. So we're going to add these eggs one at a time, and we're going to stir everything together just until the egg is combined before adding the next one. You don't want to be mixing on high speed here, just get it nicely combined. And once you've added your last egg, we can go ahead and stop, and I just like to use my spatula to make sure we don't have any lumps from the cream cheese and make sure the eggs are well incorporated. You should have a nice smooth batter at this point. So we have a nice smooth cheesecake batter here now, so I'm just gonna set this aside and I'm going to grab our baking pan. Now, I'm going to be making my chocolate cakes in 8-inch pans, so I'm going to be using an 8-inch springform pan. Of course, if you're making 9-inch cake layers, you could use a 9-inch springform. That would be fine. Now, today's cheesecake is not going to be getting a crust because it doesn't need it, but we wanna make it easy to remove the cheesecake from the pan when it's finished baking. So to do this, I just take a piece of parchment paper and I place it over the bottom of the springform pan, and then I just close the ring around that. And this will make it nice and easy to remove the cheesecake when the time comes. Now we'll just pour this cheesecake batter into our prepared pan. To smooth it out a little bit. And we'll take this over to our 325 Fahrenheit oven, where it's going to need to bake for about 35 to 40 minutes. When your cheesecake is finished baking, it should still be a little bit jiggly in the center when you jostle it like this. You may notice some small cracks around the edges. It may be beginning to turn a very light golden brown around the edges. You don't want to overbake it though, so make sure you check a little bit early rather than a little bit late. And then we'll just let this cheesecake cool for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then I like to take a knife and run that along the edge of the cheesecake to separate it from the pan. Now, this will help keep the cheesecake from cracking. There are a couple other things you could do to help keep it from cracking, like you could open the oven door and leave it in the oven so that it cools nice and gradually. Since this is going inside a cake, I'm really not worried about a few cracks at this point though. So our cheesecake is baked, but it's not going to be ready to use for at least 4 to 6 hours. So we're going to let it cool for about an hour at room temperature and then pop it in the fridge, where we're going to let it cool completely before we proceed with this recipe. All right, so with our cheesecake prepped, now we can move on to our dark chocolate cake layers. Now you're going to want to preheat your oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit and grab yourself a large mixing bowl. Now here we'll combine 1 3/4 cup all-purpose flour, 1 cup firmly packed light brown sugar, 1 cup of granulated sugar, and we'll also add 3/4 cup of dark cocoa powder. Now, dark cocoa powder is typically sold right next to the regular or other brands of cocoa powder in the grocery store. If you can't find dark cocoa, you can use Dutch process instead. We'll also add 3/4 teaspoon of salt and 1.5 teaspoons of baking soda, and we'll whisk everything together until it's nicely combined. Next, we're going to be adding a blend of butter and oil in today's recipe. We're going to add 1/2 cup of melted unsalted butter. We're also going to be adding 2/3 cup of a neutral cooking oil, such as canola oil or vegetable oil. I'm using canola oil today. Now I love using this blend of oil and butter. The oil adds really great moisture to the cake, and since this cake is going to need to be refrigerated because of the cheesecake inside, it really helps to have the moisture from the oil to keep that cake nice and tender and moist. However, the butter that we're adding is going to add a great flavor to the cake, so I love using a blend of the two. We'll also add 2 large eggs, and ideally these should be at room temperature, and 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract. And I am going to use my electric mixer to stir everything together until it is nicely combined. The mixture will be pretty stiff and thick at this point. Just keep mixing until everything is well combined. Next, we'll stir in 1 cup of buttermilk. And ideally, this should be at room temperature as well. In a perfect baking world, all of your ingredients would be the same temperature. All right, the next thing that you need is 1/2 cup of very hot water. This can be very hot water or it can be boiling water. The important thing is that it's super hot. What this hot water is going to do is it's going to bloom the cocoa powder that's in our cake batter, giving our cake a really intense chocolate flavor. Now add this carefully because you do not want to splash yourself. Okay, so once you have your cake batter prepped, it should be nice and smooth. There should be no lumps remaining. You want it to be a nice, silky, cohesive batter. We can go ahead and divide this into our cake pans. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be baking this in 2 8-inch cake pans today. If you want to use 9-inch pans instead, make sure you just check out the notes in the printable recipe in the description. Now, because we want our cakes to come out of our pan nicely, I have lined these with parchment paper liners, and I have greased these with baking spray. The baking spray is on the side. Make sure you use the baking spray that includes flour, otherwise the cakes are more likely to stick. And these are just parchment paper rounds that I literally cut out of my parchment paper. All right, so we'll evenly divide our batter into these 2 cake pans. Looks pretty good. I'm usually not very good at dividing the cake batter evenly. We'll take this over to our 350-degree Fahrenheit oven, where it's going to need to bake for about 33 to 35 minutes, or until a toothpick inserted in the center of the cake comes out clean or with a few moist crumbs. Once the cakes have finished baking, we'll let them cool in their pans for about 15 minutes, and then I like to take a knife and run it along the side of the cake just in case there was any sticking. Mine actually looks pretty good. And then we'll carefully invert this onto a cooling rack to cool completely. And see how nice and clean that comes out of the cake pan? That's perfect. It's important that you let your cakes cool completely before we go any further. So once your cakes are cooled completely and your cheesecake has chilled completely, we can go ahead and proceed with the assembly. Now let's grab our cheesecake out of the fridge where it should be nice and chilled, and we are going to release this from the pan. You can see I have a little bit of cracking here, not a big deal because it's going inside the cake. Now my cheesecake baked with a little bit of a ridge around the edges where it meets the springform pan. Just because I want to have a nice level cake, I'm just going to take a sharp knife and just use that to gently saw off those ridges, just so I have a nice level cheesecake. All right, so our cheesecake is prepped and ready. Let's set this aside and we can start assembling everything. Now, of course, we need to talk about frosting. I have made a double batch of my cream cheese frosting here, divided it into 2 bowls, roughly into 2 bowls. It doesn't need to be exact. And then in one of the bowls, I've added a 1/3 cup of dark cocoa powder to make a chocolate frosting. Now, you can use just one type of frosting. You can use any frosting you'd like for this recipe, but I am going to be showing you how to make that marbled looking appearance that I showed over on the blog and I showed on Instagram that a lot of you wanted to see how it's done. So we're going to be doing that today. So we're going to start with one of our completely cooled cake layers, and these bake up nice and flat, but if yours didn't for any reason, I would recommend leveling it. That way you have a nice level cake when you're finished. Now I'm just going to spread a little bit of the chocolate frosting on one layer. And now we can grab our cheesecake and we are going to carefully transfer this over to our cake. I just like to put my hand on top and just carefully flip it and place this on top of the chocolate cake. Remove that parchment paper because we don't need that anymore, obviously. We'll spread another thin layer of chocolate frosting on top of the cheesecake. And now we'll place our other cake right on top of that cheesecake. Now anytime I ice a cake, I like to do a quick crumb coat just to catch any crumbs so I have a nice smooth finish. So I'm just going to take some of my vanilla cream cheese frosting and use that to do a really thin layer around the cake so we'll catch any crumbs. Now we'll place the cake in the fridge or freezer for 10 to 15 minutes to let that frosting set up and hold those crumbs in. All right, so our crumb coating has chilled so we can finish frosting our cake. Now I usually start with my white cream cheese frosting and I use more than I really think I need. I'm just going to kind of Slap that on there. Really large dollops of cream cheese frosting on top and all around the side. Now grab your chocolate frosting and we're gonna do the same thing. I do use less chocolate frosting than white frosting just because the chocolate can be really overpowering really quickly. And then I like to take my spatula and just smooth the two frostings together. Now we put a lot of icing on this cake, so we're going to be getting a lot of excess off the cake as we go around it with our spatula and as we smooth it. I just take that excess frosting and I just wipe it on my bowl because I'm going to go back and use that when I put my swirls on top of the cake. Finishing touch. Now, of course, you don't want to overdo it, especially with the chocolate icing, or else your cake is going to look dirty rather than marbled. If you do find you've got too much chocolate in one spot, like I do here, I'll just take a little bit of the white frosting and swirl that in. Now I want to make sure everything's nice and smooth around the sides and on top. If you want to do a ganache topping, I do have a video on how to do a ganache drip. It's really simple, but today I'm just going to be taking my leftover frosting here. I'm going to drop this in a piping bag. This is fitted with an 849 tip. I also love the 848 tip. They are very similar. And you can just pipe the decorative marbled swirl on top. All right, all that is left to do is to dig into this cake. Now I do like to chill the cake for at least 10 to 15 minutes before I cut in, just because it can get a little messy if you don't. I also like to run my knife under really hot water just so I get a nice clean cut. Just run it under hot water and then dry it off before cutting in. Look at that, isn't that beautiful? And that is how you make a cheesecake stuffed dark chocolate cake with marbled cream cheese frosting. This cake is extremely decadent. I cannot wait for you to try it out. And if you do, please leave me a comment and let me know what you think. I always love hearing from you. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Oh man. This is the best cake in the world.